keen to know how you came to be here tonight. We put a huge effort into trying to communicate the events on. So would you just show your hands, please? Who's here from South Shore? Big turnout. Hold your hands up for a minute, please. Thank you. South Brighton? Fantastic. New Brighton? Awesome. North Brighton? And Waimaribig? Sorry? Spencerville? Forgot. Right, didn't work. Anywhere else? Awesome. Waimak? Yeah, Waimakariri. Oh.
Darlington.
Welcome. Welcome. How did you find out about it? Was it social media? Hands up. How about our flyers? Wonderful. All that indeed. Surely that was worth it. How about from the grapevine? Oh, yeah. The area is a coastal hazard. It's confusing. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't to me anyway. So now, while it might be tempting to think this meeting's about climate change, it's simply not. And we won't be addressing the issues here tonight of climate change. Tonight we're going to hear about a specific piece of science that has an impact on our sandy coastline. Our intention is to let you know what our community organisations have been doing and to introduce that piece of the jigsaw that we hope will provide you a better understanding of our coastal environment. Local long-time resident, Dame Eleanor, will give you an overview of why we've invited you here tonight, and then you'll hear from two other guest speakers, both of whom have come to us voluntarily and out of the goodness of their hearts. We had planned to have another speaker. However, unfortunately, Jim Lundy has not been able to come tonight, and given our full agenda, we have agreed that it's probably best we focus on the NIWA report anyway. There will be a short window for questions after our speakers have spoken, but for those we don't get to, we've created a Gmail account. So there's a flyer out the front here. Some of it's been given to some of you. Take that away, please. If you send your questions or comments or afterthoughts into that address, we'll do our best to answer them, have them answered, or respond to them. In the interest of time and respect for others, if you have a question, would you raise your hand, please? And when you do, and it's your turn, we'll bring a mic to you. If you have a technical question, please just be mindful of the audience. It might be better that you ask a technical question of the speakers after the event. This is science, and a lot of it goes way over my head, so just be conscious of the room, please, as you're asking those questions. We've also invited the people who aspire to be your local body representatives, the candidates who put themselves up. This is not here, we are not here, it's not a candidates meeting. We've asked the candidates to come along and listen to what the community has to say, the community they aspire to represent. Could the candidates just stand, please, so people can see who you are? Thank you for putting your names up. Thank you for standing for us. Thank you for coming to listen to us tonight. I'm sure the candidates will be willing to stay for a wee while after the formal proceedings and answer any questions you have of them individually. Again, I repeat, this is not a meet candidates meeting. Candidates, I'm sure the community would appreciate if you can stay behind and answer questions. So, without further ado, Eleanor, the floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, katoa. Tēnā koe, tā tipuni, tēnā koe, Lady Central. I'm just so thrilled that you people have taken time out of your busy schedule to be here tonight. It's a real privilege to have this room filled with fantastic people who live in the coastal ward. It's what makes our Our diversity of interests is what makes this community such an exciting place to live. Thank you, really appreciate it. Getting into the subject for my part of this presentation. Following the earthquakes, a critical decision was made to rebuild our city, including the eastern suburbs. During a crisis, for good reason, many decisions are made quickly. Whether for good or for bad, we are here today as a result of those decisions, and in addition to the fact that everything's been compounded by climate change. Sadly, over the last 10 years, the earthquakes, the lack of earthquake repairs, the pandemic, other events, and our dealings with council have made us feel like we're always in crisis. Climate change is very serious, and it's easy to catastrophise about it or freak out about it, and that just immobilises us. Our meeting today will give residents of the coastal ward confidence that we can take a breather and make well-considered, collaborative and properly informed decisions about our future. This evening we'll show you the experience that many of us have had when dealing with council, how the current council system operates, council strategies and the outcomes these produce, the potential for our area, and why the NIWA Sand Budget Report is so important for us. Our guest speaker is Hicks, who will talk about the NIWA Sand Budget Report, and Leo Donnelly, public law specialist and former ombudsman, is available to speak about the issues relevant to the situation here. But let's go back and look at how current council systems operate, its attitudes, processes and outcomes, and how they impact on what happens or doesn't happen in our area. There's some unfinished business here. Before we as a district can begin our climate change discussions with councils, some rebalancing needs to happen. Our outstanding earthquake issues need to be fixed so that we can have equity of recovery with the rest of the city. And council needs to rebuild trust with the East. One of the main reasons that we've called this meeting is that the council have recently been consulting on coastal hazards. The decisions they make will affect our future, our homes and our community. Many of us made submissions during this consultation period, and we did so in good faith. Questions about the technical modelling and other associated matters resulted in some submitters being labelled as climate sceptics by council staff. People who consider themselves to be fully on board with climate change found these statements bewildering and were shocked that they weren't going to be investigated further. Labelling is dangerous. It divides people, is alienating, and influences other people's perceptions of us. The result is we can be dismissed and ignored. These sort of statements are unhelpful, unprofessional, and demonstrate closed-mindedness. They show that the community engagement process has fallen over. This meeting, however, is not about those submissions. Today we're hearing about a specific piece of science that has an impact on our sandy coastline. We know council has obligations to central government to plan for climate change. This doesn't give them permission, however, to constantly use the worst case scenarios and scary language with us. Some far too hasty decisions have been made about our sandy coastline. While we all know about the general trends of climate change, local responses can be far more unpredictable. During the recent flooding events, it wasn't our areas that needed help. Flooding was experienced as far afield as Hoon Hay. Flooding is obviously a citywide problem. We need to take a more considered approach. The Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act, a law that's now mostly been repealed, was set up to manage the post-earthquake reconstruction and regeneration. New Brighton was intended to receive special attention and support. However, due to council's wish to retain a sense of control over what was happening in the region, the reference to New Brighton was removed before it became law. While Council promised to keep New Brighton as a priority and for this prioritisation to be supported with funding, it hasn't happened. It's a broken promise, but one that must be honoured. Many of you will remember a public meeting here that was held when our previous councillor and 3 community boards faced disciplinary action. This arose from a dispute about the proposed district plan changes. An independent inquiry was promised by the Mayor, but this didn't happen. Another process was set up, but the accused were not included or spoken to. This is important for 2 reasons. It shows a loss of trust and a breakdown in the relationship between community representatives and council staff. The issue is back on the table. Council is looking at this again. We now have more information about what's happening to our sandy coastline. Hopefully this, combined with a better engagement process, should result in a better outcome. Several undertakings have been given over the years to remediate earthquake damage to the estuary edge. In 2019, a very respected local GP gave a heartfelt plea for it to be repaired. Council inaction was having an impact on the health and well-being of our community. Council resolved to repair this precise part of the estuary edge and for this to be done urgently and for funding to be provided. Although this was defined as being urgent, nothing has happened. Who is responsible to ensure that council resolutions are actioned? Surely it's not us. This is what inequity looks like. We're happy for Redcliffs. We don't want to look the same. We're proud of our own uniqueness and we have our own approved council approved estuary edge design. No more dawdling. This must be fast-tracked and started tomorrow. We need to say the vast majority of council staff do amazing work for us and our city. However, our relationship with council over coastal hazards and earthquake remediation is on pretty rocky ground. Post-earthquake, our engagement with council has commonly been done through what is essentially the comms team. Now, a comms team usually is there to help explain and implement policy. We believe this process desperately needs to be reviewed. We need to press pause, rewind and agree on a better process for engagement with council. Good engagement doesn't mean setting up another group. Many of you here tonight will have been involved in these processes. You've put your energy into some of these groups. To what purpose? Very little, and to the point of utter exhaustion. The strategy seems to be if council doesn't get the answer they want, then they'll go and ask it again or form another group. We have a perfectly good structure already set up to be our primary channel of communication and engagement with council. It's our community board. Its primary role is to represent and act as an advocate for the interests of its community. Note, however, the community board is not an arm of council. Your community board members need to be people who can be trusted, who will represent your views and do all they can to ensure residents are informed about local issues, and they must be prepared to stand up for issues that matter. Coastal ward residents love this area and they're happy to share it with others. How is it that Brighton's potential hasn't been fully realised? Significant funds were provided for recovery and repair of communities, and New Brighton was supposed to be given priority. What's been spent and where? We need to know. Every time we enter or leave Brighton via Pages Road, which you know is the main road into Brighton, and cross the Brighton Bridge, we are reminded of what could be. This should be the proud gateway to Christchurch's playground, the beach, park, estuary wildlife, bird forest, right down through to Spencerville. We've all seen promotional material about the beach, the pier and the hot pools, So unless our visitors drop in by helicopter, what sort of a welcome does this give them? And what does it say about council? How often have we been told that council can't afford to do the major works that we expect to be done, but it seems they can elsewhere? We saw how difficult it was for DCL. It seemed to Rob Hall that council had other priorities. That cannot continue. There must be a commitment to regenerate our area as promised. Similarly, we all know only too well about the unresolved post-earthquake issues in Brighton Mall. These buildings show what happens when there's no investment of money or effort into an area. The rundown state of the mall indicates council's lack of commitment to kickstart things and implement the Brighton master plan. Local businesses are generally well supported by their communities, as are ours. However, 81% of the spend goes out of this area. Developers and investors, my goodness, you've got dream opportunities here. When we advocated strongly for the hot pools, we were told there'd be a drain on the city coffers to the value of $1 million a year. And indeed, there'd be a white elephant. We were made to feel guilty, uninformed and irresponsible for asking for these pools. Puna Tai Moana doesn't just break even, it adds significantly to the bottom line. While the Westpac building is now council owned, the Save Mart building next door really needs to be bought to make the Oranabe extension and the new Brighton master plan fully operational and to kickstart the village centre. How many times have you heard the excuse? It costs too much. But wasn't that what they said about the pools? Investment in Brighton goes well beyond any benefits to us. It's investment for Christchurch and its visitors. The potential contribution that we can make to the well-being and economy of the city needs to be properly understood and calculated. Coming back to the issue of the coastal hazards and consultation. When council make big decisions, such as managing climate change, they rightly bring in the scientists and the experts. The problem is, Aotearoa New Zealand is very small and the pool of experts limited. So, over time, there's quite a lot of cross-pollination. We need to be assured that those who review important and possibly contentious reports such as these are as independent as possible from one another. We knew a report had been done on our sandy coastline and we asked council staff about it, but it wasn't forthcoming and we couldn't find it online. So in September 2018, an official information request was made. Access to what we discovered was a NIWA report was refused with very little explanation other than to be told that it should be made public by the end of 2018. In December 2019, a year later, the reports, and there were 2 of them, were put online on the council website. While the person making the official information request was notified and sent a copy, there was no media statement, no media release. It took a while before the rest of us found out about it. If there'd been a good, transparent relationship with council, then we could have had the meeting that we're having here tonight, way back in 2020. On reading the NIWA report, many of us felt that it wasn't being properly incorporated into the reports before council. And it was that led to us making the submissions that we've already talked about. Sadly, some coastal areas such as Homewana are already badly affected by erosion and people have had to move away. The evidence is clear. Our sandy coastline, however, looks completely different. But is this picture misleading? We need to cast some light onto this issue. Our guest speaker, Murray Hicks, ex-NIWA Principal Scientist, River and Coastal Geomorphology, lead writer of the NIWA Sand Budget Reports, is here today to help us understand NIWA's findings and to show how they impact on the known science at this time. Thank you, Mark.
Right, well, pretty impressive groups here. When Eleanor invited me along, it kind of gave the impression that it might be a gathering of a few people around the coffee table. So I'm in awe of the turnout here, and I hope to be able to keep you interested. I think I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes. That's I think it will take that long to get through the material that I'll talk about. So Eleanor gave me an introduction, but I'm now an ex-NIWA scientist. I retired from NIWA in 2019, and over my career I've spent some time on and off in different parts of the country working on coastal hazard assessment. So it's a mixture of new and old stuff to me, and I was the lead author on 2 reports that were commissioned by the Christchurch City Council. They were what you call gap filling reports, filling information gaps, and the purpose of doing the studies and writing the reports was to provide a resource to assist with the management of coastal hazards and going on into the future. So why I'm here tonight is because Eleanor invited me along, and in particular she wanted me to speak on the importance of the Waimakariri River and supplying sand to the foreshore along here between the Waimak mouth and the estuary, and also to put what I know and what was in the NIWA reports in the context of what's where that information has or may not have been taken through the studies of Tonkin and Taylor and on into the work by Jacobs, where they really narrowed down the options of hazard zones. I want to first of all issue some warnings. What I'm talking about, it's purely based on the information in our NIWA reports, also information in the Tonkin and Taylor report and in the Jacobs report. So there's no new information that might be being presented in a different way. Also, because it's a pretty complex area, I'm going to deal with numbers that are averaged along shore to give an impression of what I think will happen to that span of shore overall. So it's not necessarily representative of individual locations, so just bear that in mind. And the other thing is that I've done some reasonably simple calculations, nothing at the level of the probability analysis that Tonkin and Taylor did. And so the numbers I'll be presenting, their sort of best estimate is likely as not results or trends. So it's a general sort of overview assessment of the shore and where it's heading. So like all assessments, those numbers carry some uncertainty, and as I said before, they're not, they may not be exactly applicable to any individual location. Okay, the last thing to warn you about is I could get pretty technical in places, so please suffer that. I'll try and keep things simple. So I'm now, having said that, I'm going to jump straight into some pretty nasty stuff. I need a glass of water to get through it. You might need something stronger. But the essential thing is that, well, the foundation, if you like, of the Tonkin and Taylor work and where Jacobs took it is this equation that predicts the area of backshore, and by backshore I mean the dune land immediately landward of the shoreline, the vegetation edge of the boom, the beach and all the rest of it. It predicts the area of the backshore that's vulnerable to coastal hazards. And in that equation is the sum of 4 hazards, if you like. The first one is this short-term erosion just due to storm waves coming in and belting the shore and taking sand offshore and up while that sand comes back again, and nonetheless it cuts out an erosion bite. And the next term is this dune face instability one. When you get storms coming back, I'll crouch down, but that seems to work. When storms cut back a dune face, they leave a really steep face, and that's unstable for a while under gravity, so you need to make an allowance for that as well. So those two terms are what we call the current hazard. They're out there now. And if we look into the future though, there's two other terms we need to consider. One is a long-term trend in the shoreline, and obviously if there's a long-term erosion trend observed in the past, project that into the future, that's going to create an additional width of hazard zone, so you need to allow for that. And the other term is the effect of sea level rise. When the sea rises, it creates a demand for sand on the beach, and if that's not met, the waves will take the sand and erode the shore. So those are the four terms. So just developing those two terms on the right a bit more. I'll talk first about the sea level erosion term. I won't spend too much time on that, but it depends upon obviously the extent or the rate of rise in sea level, but it also depends upon the shape of the beach profile. And the way that's calculated is just with a very simple rule called the Brun rule. And that says that if you have a can't see the mouse there, so I'll just take this microphone. And if you have a simple, a rise in sea level of magnitude S, the extent of shore retreat x is equal to S divided by what turns out to be the slope, the average slope of the beach between the dune crest out to the depth where the sand exchanges with the foreshore no longer become significant. So it's roughly the average slope of the active part of the beach. So that's all I'll say about that, except that I will bring it up a bit later on, so just kind of remember that. And then, in fact, I'll just hang on to this at some point. The really important term is this one here, the long-term erosion trend, and that depends principally on the supply of sand coming to the beach from external sources. If there's a surplus of that sand, the shore will go out. If there's a deficit of that sand compared to other losses of sand, the shore will go back. So that was really the main application area of our coastal sand budget investigations, both in terms of the present situation and into the future. So this summarises the findings from our first report. That was all about the current budget, and so that was based on historical evidence and some modelling. And I've really only put up here the key numbers, but the essence of it is that on average every year there's about 745,000, 750,000 cubic metres of sand gets squirted out from the Waimak River mouth. That's quite a lot of sand. And it turns out that because a lot of that sand is actually very fine grade, it's too fine to actually sit stably on the beach, it gets washed by waves offshore and doesn't play any part in the beach budget. So there's 64% of that river export is lost offshore, and of the residual 36%, 2/3 or 24.5 is washed by waves along shore to the south, and the residual third, oh that's good, yep. See how this works. Yeah, and the residual third goes north. And the upshot of that spreading of the sand is that historically, on average, the foreshore has gone out at a rate of around about 0.3 of a metre a year for past decades. So there's a surplus of sand, and that's why the shore is going out, despite some historical rise in sea level. So I just want to talk some more about the wave climate and why there's this switch at the river mouth. And there's two sets of waves come into the shore. One set is southerly swell, which comes up from the deep southern ocean and wraps around Banks Peninsula. And it breaks at an angle against the shore. It's not a very big angle, but it's a small angle. And here's an example here. And you can see that the waves forming a very faint, small angle. And that angle is enough to pass momentum into the surf zone, and it drives a longshore current. And the waves stir the sand up, and the current moves the stirred sand up along, so that gives it a longshore transport to the north. But I'm sure you'll be saying that it blows, it's northeasterly most of the time. So this is this lower picture here. When the nor'easter comes in, the breaker angle is in the opposite direction, and that drives the transport down to the south. So from the river mouth down Christchurch shore. And it's that easterly wave regime that prevails in the southern end of the bay. The southerly regime prevails at the northern end because it's more out of the shelter of Banks Peninsula. But that's the reason why 2/3 of the Waimak sand comes south to Christchurch and the other third goes north. And obviously we have to be concerned about any future changes in wave climate that might alter that balance and upset that. And so the key points from the study of the current budget was that obviously the river produces sand load, and how much of that actually sticks on the beach depends upon its size grading, and how much of it gets along shore in front of Christchurch, where we are now, depends upon the balance of transport driven northward by the southerly waves and southward by the nor'easter. So there's a number of things that ended up producing the current situation we have and delivering that advanced shoreline. Now we're going to jump into what might happen in 100 years in the future under an extreme climate change scenario. This is if you're familiar with those scenarios, the RCP 8.5 scenario, which is that would arise with really unchecked greenhouse gas emissions, and it's kind of top end of the scale but unlikely, but it has been adopted by the councils for planning purposes on I guess an ultra safe conservative basis. Anyway, so these are the numbers that we got under that condition. First of all, erosion would increase in the Waimak area catchment. We estimate there'd be 28% more sand coming down the river, and that's because under the changed climate it would rain more and more intensely, particularly in the headwaters. And I think if you've been watching TV last week and saw what was going on in Nelson, you can see what intense rainfall does in terms of intensified erosion. Another thing that would happen though is the expectation that irrigation water takes would increase across the Canterbury Plains, and generally when you take irrigation water you extract a bit of sand with it as well, and often that sand doesn't always, it's supposed to, but it doesn't always get returned back to the river. So there's losses there of about 3%. And when you get down to the river mouth, because this is an extreme climate change scenario involving a rise in sea level, some of the sand will get trapped in the tidal reach of the Waimak and also in Brooklyn's lagoon. So we have another 1% of the load lost there. And the other loss area is down at the Avon Heathcote Inlet. With a rising sea level, there's more water flushing in and out of the inlet, and that volume of water going out with each tide is what we call the tidal prism. And so that, with a bigger tidal prism, the inlet builds a larger ebb tidal delta, big lump of sand off the inlet entrance. And so that sand, that delta, that bigger delta has to be stocked with sand from somewhere, and so it gets swiped from the beaches, and so that's sort of a loss out of the beach sediment budget that we need to be aware about. But the other thing you might have noticed is that there's a subtle rebalance in these figures on how much sand goes south and how much goes north. There's only a few % difference, but what we discovered was in modelling with this extreme scenario was that the southerly waves got more energy and they were more effective at shifting sand further north, so it's just kind of modulated this supply of sand from the river mouth along to the shore. So in some respects, climate change giveth in terms of extra sand, but in other respects it taketh away. And so that the net change in the sand supply after 100 years of this scenario drops down to a 20% increase, but that's the change after 100 years. The average change over that 100 years is only 10%, so that kind of brings the figures down to a sort of a moderate level, but as I show you in the next slides, that's still pretty useful. You wish you stayed at home and watched the chase. So it's a busy slide, but I'll guide you through it because it's an important one. We'll start off with this. This is the equation I showed you before. It's predicting the area subject to coastal hazards, and it's got that current hazard term, which is basically dragged landward or seaward up to the shoreline, and it's got these the long-term trend term, and then the effective sea level rise. And I'm going to apply this equation over time to this sea level curve here. So this is sea level time from 2020. The green curve is what's known as the SSP 8.5 median curve. Again, that's the latest incarnation of the more extreme climate change scenarios. So it's not really meant to get too worse than that. But though, again, that's the scenario that was adopted by Jacobs for this report. Okay, so we're going to move on to this graph here now, and what we've got is the rate of change of these two components in this equation here, expressed in terms of metres per year of shoreline movement going forward in time. And here's the zero line. If the curve plots over here, it signals things should advance, and if it plots over here, things should retreat. And this green line here is just a component of the long-term trend calculated with the increase in river load. And what it shows is that gradually over time that term increases with that increasing net river load. And this blue curve here, which is negative or minus, gradually increases with time as well because of the rising sea level. And the grey curve here is the residual of the sum of those. And so right down at 2020, the grey curve is positive, which means the shore is still going up. After about 30 years, it hits zero, which means the shore's at a turning point. It's starting to retreat. And you can replot these curves into this over here as actually a projection of where the future shoreline will be. So here we go, this is the shore looking out the window pretty much at the moment, with this grey curve, and the projection is that for about the next 30 years, and remember this is under this extreme scenario, the shore would continue to go out, but after that it would start to recede, and by 2080, after 60 years, it will be back to where we are now. And after that, it would keep eroding and going back. And this red line is the hazard line, which when you add on this short face and dune face instability term, which is constant. It doesn't change as long as the wave climate doesn't change in terms of wave energy. So that line follows the shoreline. So the important thing that this is showing is that even under this extreme scenario, if you allow for increased river load under that scenario, which is what we expect, you will get something like a 60-year holiday before you pass into an erosion treaty. And just as, sorry I forgot to mention, just as a bit of a scale, if you like, this is a slice of the shore pinched from Google Earth, and the shoreline there lines up with the zero line, and it's the graph scaled so that 40 metres on the graph is about in the middle of the dune field. So we're not talking about huge amounts of erosion here, even under this extreme scenario. Let's see if you clap in 100 years' time. Right. So now what we're going to do is, okay, what happens if we don't increase the supply of Waimak sand over that scenario? What's going to happen? And so what I'm showing here are the same curves. Under that no increase of sand from the river, where things are shifting around a bit. So this green curve is the long-term component due to the sand budget surplus. So there's still a steady supply of sand coming down, but we've got this rise in sea level, and so it shifts the net rate of change in the shoreline a bit more into the more severe zone. And when we move across into the shoreline plots here, we're looking now at this dotted line here. But the important thing, even not, excuse me, even disregarding, not sure where my voice has gone. There we go, it's got it back again. Even disregarding the increase in river sand load, you've still got that holiday period. It's about 10 years shorter. And what happens after that, when you pass the tipping point, is that the erosion is more intense. The shoreline goes back more rapidly. But again, this is under this extreme scenario, but this time not accounting for river load. So that's kind of where I get applying that coastal hazard formula to the data that we produced in our studies a few years ago. Since then, Tonkin and Taylor have done these studies applying this erosion assessment formula, and they applied that to a whole, I think it was about 12 different sea level rise future management term combinations, and some of those did include changes in the river sand supply. And they did a pretty sophisticated analysis that I generally don't have any problem with. I think it was well done. And they passed their work on to Jacobs, who basically plucked out a couple of scenario combinations and then developed that further. So in reading through those two reports, and I was curious to trace what had happened to our information from the reports that we did back in 2018. I noticed a couple of things, so I want to talk about those. The first one is about the discounting of historical sea level rise in the coastal hazard assessment, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And the other one was our projected increases in sand load, even though they did make their way into the Tonkin and Taylor report. Somewhere between the Tonkin and Taylor report and the Jacobs report, they kind of fell off the table, and they weren't taken any further. So I want to explain what I think happened there. So discounting sea level rise. And again, sorry, this is another graph, but you're probably hopefully getting used to them by now. So, sea level rise over time, and the black curve is this SSP 8.5 extreme rate of rise scenario, and the green one is the historical rate of rise over the last 100 years. It's been slightly less than 2 millimetres a year, but we'll call it 2 millimetres a year. So the important thing about that is that it's been going on all the time, and the shore here has been advancing despite that. And it's implicit in the long-term erosion trend that's been developed from the historical data, so that when you project that long-term erosion trend off into the future, it's already got built into it 2 millimetres per year of sea level rise. So that needs to be discounted when you're predicting the effect of a future sea level rise. If you don't do that, you're double accounting, if you like. So that needs to be taken care of. And I've been through the Tonkin and Taylor report, and as far as I can see, they didn't do that discount. So I think, and I'll show you in a minute, I think the consequence of that is that things have been slightly overcooked in terms of where their hazard lines are. And so looking at where the increased river sand load during the extreme climate change scenario, what happened to that? So you've seen this graph before, but it's sea level rise into the future, and these brown boxes, there's 12 of them, they're the scenarios that Tonkin and Taylor did their sophisticated probabilistic modelling on. So they're different combinations of sea level rise and over different terms. And this is the one that they looked at changing river loads on, only one. And these are the two that Jacobs plucked out to advance the work forward. And both of those two scenarios are in the extreme sea level bracket, and it was during that extreme sea level climate change bracket that we calculated an increase in WIMAX sediment load. So really what should have been done is that there should have been a Tonkin and Taylor run done for these two values with an increased sediment load. And so, and I think what happened was Jacobs just worked with what scenarios were run. And there wasn't one with the right sea level rise increments over the right time frames, and so they worked with what they had. And I think it probably would have been a good idea to go back and ask Tonkin and Taylor to run another one or two. Anyway, let's look at the consequences of that. So hopefully you're familiar with this type of graph again. So what's the impact? So this is working with figures now from Tonkin and Taylor's, I think it's their table 4.9, which is the parameters they use in calculating the hazard zone width. Again with that extreme scenario. And so this is the line you get for the shoreline projection into the future, this solid red line. If, and that, remember that didn't have an increase in sea level in that. If you put in the increase, the increase in river load, if you put in the increase in river load, you get that line, that things back off a bit. If you discount for historical sea level rise on the long-term trend, you end up with this dotted line, which is much more rosy. This one here goes straight into an erosion trend. When you fix those two issues, you start getting a period of slightly advancing shoreline. And I've left my grey line there from the figures from my report in there just for comparison. So the lines are similar. They don't exactly line up because doing an averaging and the average of averages don't always balance, but it's pretty similar. But the important thing is that out by 2130, because of those two issues, I think they've overclocked the hazard line width by about 20 metres at that stage. And the next thing I want to show, or with us, really address the question of this, the hazard with climate change scenarios that have been used are pretty extreme. They're top end, they're ultra conservative. If you want to sort of be safe, absolutely safe, it's fine to use those scenarios, but other ones, less steep, are perhaps considered more likely. And so I've looked at the consequences of using perhaps a more likely sea level rise scenario, which is the one I've worked with is RCP 4.5, which is this one here, and it features at a 7 millimetre, we'd be swimming if it was 7 metres a year, 7 millimetres a year, reasonably steady increase in sea level into the next century. And remember that the current historical sea level was 2 millimetres a year, so that's kind of, it's tripling it. So what is that? Using the Tonkin and Taylor figures, what does that show? And under that scenario too, we predicted no increase in river sediment load, so that's kind of out of the equation at this stage. But what's the effect of just not considering that, not discounting the future sea level rise for historical? So this is the curve, 3-year line that you get if you don't do the discounting, and it's showing a steady erosion. I mean, it's not great. It's only by 2130 it's about 12 metres, so it's not large. But and maybe this is nitpicking. But if you do that discount, what we get is it's pretty much showing a stable trend, no change at all. So even without any increase, the WIMAC under that scenario is doing its job of keeping the shoreline stable. So that was the really simple stuff. Now I'm going to get on to something really complicated. I think probably what you've gathered by now is that the shoreline out here is in a pretty delicate balance between sand sources and the effect of rising sea level. And this, I've adapted this thing called the Lane's balance, and it was developed by an old-time river geomorphologist for river erosion, but I think it works really, really well for the coastal situation too. Because basically, you're balancing the supply of sand, and the supply of sand comes from the Waimakere River. Some of that Waimak supply is lost into things like the tidal deltas and the tidal reach of the Waimak. So a bit of it falls off. What the wave climate is doing kind of modulates how much of that actually gets biffed south into the Christchurch shore, so that's an important thing. And that supply, net supply, is there to counterbalance the demand for sand by rising sea level. So basically, the more water you put in the bucket, the more sea level rises, the heavier that becomes, and that is also governed by the geometry or the slope of the beach profile, which is why things might be a bit different if the beach is steeper at so one end of the shore than the other. So there's a balance. It's pretty delicate, but presently, until now anyway, and hopefully into the future, the supply there's a surplus supply, and that's dominant. And this balance thing is tilted over. Sorry, it's gone that way. It's gone into the advanced thing, and so that's where it is at the moment. And as sea level rises, that bucket there is going to get heavier and heavier. We're not thinking that the beach profile shape will change. We're thinking that this might slide a bit more towards the pivot, which is not so flash, but we're thinking that this pile of sand here will grow despite it's falling off into these sediment traps. And the net effect will be that for the first maybe 50 or 60 years, it will still I've lost my green pointer, it doesn't matter, I think you can see where I'm going. So that's kind of a good tool, if you like, to understand what's going on and how sensitive things are, because this is it's in the geomorphic terms, we call it a dynamic equilibrium. It comes at an equilibrium, but that might change as the forces controlling it change. And so even a small change in one of these influences, one of these terms, can upset that balance. But also errors or bias in the numbers that are put into the balance can give out perhaps a false impression of where things are going to go. So that's kind of my attempt to sort of sum up the whole situation and how tricky it is often to make predictions of where the shore's going to be. So I'll wind up there just by sort of summarising the main points. And the first one is that the Christchurch shore is really in a state of dynamic equilibrium. And it's certainly sensitive to the changes in the Waimak River sand load, and also to the nearshore wave climate. And the shoreline is currently advancing by virtue of a surplus supply of river sand over the demand to build up the profile to counteract historical rises in sea level. But under an extreme climate change scenario, things do slide a bit. There would be a holiday of some decades while the shore still went out, but then it would start to recede, it would pass the tipping point, and then it would get into an erosion trend. I think that's even with the Waimak sand load increasing. So under that scenario, there's nothing but for ongoing erosion, but that would be delayed. But I think the Tonkin and Taylor and Jacobs workflow has ended up hurrying up that tipping point between shoreline going out and tipping into an erosion trend, and then making the erosion trends more steep after that, just because they of those two issues that I mentioned, that they haven't considered an increase in river sediment load, and they haven't dealt properly with historical sea level rise and discounted that from the equation. So I guess to answer the question I asked with the title of the talk, can the Waimak save the Christchurch shore under that extreme scenario? The ultimate answer is no, but it can help delay the onset of erosion and mitigate the rate of erosion and the rate that it intensifies. But under a more middle-of-the-road climate change scenario, the shore should remain stable on average. That's the general projection there. So I think I've probably gone on long enough, bringing the results of our study up to date with these other two reports and these things. So thank you for your patience, and I didn't see too many people nodding off when I was showing graphs and talking about equations. So thank you for.
The projections you offered, even under this extreme scenario, as you talk about the 50 to 60 year holiday, and then the eroding the coastline, that's without any intervention from us.
Proactive, solution. Would dredging, for example, sort of increase the load or not?
You don't really want to decrease the load, so
Increase the load.
increase the load. Dredging would. The Waimak is effectively dredged anyway. The Waimak used to flow all over the place and over Christchurch and up into Taylor and all the rest of it from time to time. In the last 150 years or so, it's been tamed and pinned between Stockbanks rivers now. And when it was untamed, it was depositing gravel all over the place on a fan. And now it's depositing all that gravel in a gravel channel. And all of that gravel being deposited has to be dug out. If it didn't, the Waimak would very quickly climb up above its banks and would be flooding Christchurch. And so, in that sense, the river engineers got a tiger by the tail. But because the gravel's close to Christchurch and there's a good market for it, making concrete and roading and all the rest of it, it kind of works pretty well, digging that out. So there is gravel taken out there. I haven't factored that, and with the gravel, sand is taken out as well. And that doesn't factor into our budget because our station, or measuring the sand load, is actually downstream of where they're extracting gravel. So one could argue that if you stopped extracting gravel and the sand with it, you might get more sand out to the river mouth, but you'd get a whole lot more problems with flooding if you did that. So I think it's best left alone. I don't think you can tweak the Waimak much to improve its sand delivery.
Just north of the Waipu River in Gisborne, they've got concrete systems out into the sea done by the South African engineer at the Gisborne Council. How effective would some of those be along the coastline if we had to go that way? Or have you seen them?
So you talk about groins?
Yeah.
Groins work some places, but they create their own problems because the principle of a groin is where you've got the prevailing transport direction or onshore transport of sand, and the point of putting a groin in is to trap that sand, kind of like a dam on its side, if you like. And when you put the groin in, the sand builds up on one side, but unfortunately it erodes away on the other side. So you might have a nice fat beach on the north side and serious erosion on the south side. The groins really only work properly is if you import sand from somewhere and fill up the holes or get the sand bypassing. So I wouldn't really recommend a groin field.
Hi. The fact that Tonkin, Taylors and Jacobs have got a different modelling from what you've produced, do you have a view as to whether that is a result of how they were briefed or the information they had access to?
I think Tonkin and Taylor's probabilistic approach is better in the sense that it considers the uncertainties and properly deals with that and will give you a result with a distributed report of outcomes. The numbers I've given you are the ones that kind of end up in the middle of that distribution. So they're the ones that are in the confidence sense.
It's their baseline for a lot of their planning for coastal hazards. And I believe internationally that's now regarded as a scenario that's probably highly unlikely. You spoke earlier about a scenario, I think you used 4.5. What's your opinion of the scenario that may be most likely to prevail?
well, something like 4.5 is in the, yeah, and in the new way of naming things and organising them, there's the SSP shared socio-economic pathways, what it's called. So it's basically that what they do is they look at the expected global warming, increase in temperature and all the rest of it, but then also consider how humanity is going to respond to that. And the more extreme ones, like the SSP 8.5, are when humanity doesn't do a very good job at all, and the temperatures get way up to the order of over 4-degree increase by 2100 or something like that. Maybe it's 2150. So it's climate change out of control still. Whereas the more moderate ones, the SSP 4, is it 4? Yep, 4.5. I think that might be a 3-degree warming. So not quite hitting the Paris Accord ideal, but not too far beyond it, and humanity actually is having some effect in roping things in. So in that scenario was regarded as more likely, but things could still turn to custard if nasty things happen with accelerated melting of the Antarctic ice sheet. That's probably the main area of concern. So in that sense, even though the extreme 8.5 scenario might be unlikely, I think people included in there basically to hedge their bets to be ultra conservative. So I think that's kind of where it's ended up.
The southerly and the easterly.
Yep.
This year I have noticed a lot more norwesterlies. Now, with a lot more of these atmospheric rivers coming down from the Pacific, hitting the west coast, causing the norwesterlies, have you factored that sort of wind into where the sand goes?
No. Well, in a way, yes, we have, because when we did the wave modelling, we based our modelling off what was measured at the NIWA wave point off Hicks Peninsula. And there's about a 30-year record of that, and we adapted that with climate change effects, essentially. And then what we do is we numerically refract those waves, we bend them into shore and shoal them and predict what the direction of the wave's going to be against the shore and the height of the waves, and then we do our sums off that. And in the case of a northwest wind blowing, that really doesn't have much effect on the nearshore waves at all. It might flatten them a little bit, but it's reasonably cut out of the equation. The more important thing, if you get more northwest, is that you'll get more rain in the headwaters, and you will most likely get more sediment. And usually when you get more northwest, you end up having things stirred up with greater intensity down in the Southern Ocean as well. So the big southerly swells may not arrive at the same time as the northwest, but you might get them later on in the week, that sort of thing. So an intensification of that regime could have mixed benefits in terms of maybe providing more sand down the river, but it may have an impact on that balance of the drift north and south from the river mouth. So that's where this delicate balance comes in, and I would certainly be keen to see more modelling of the effects of those sorts of changes, which I think are really at a higher level than the detail of the modelling that's been done generally today. And I'm not pumping for business because I'm retired, so normally scientists say, oh, you need to do more research and please give me a whole lot of money and I'll do it for you, but no, it's not not to me, but it'd be good if someone did that.
We promised Murray wouldn't be answering questions all night.
Yeah, but very informative. It's information which basically better informs you as to issues behind so that you're making judgments. And I think the important thing in the context I think I'm described as having come down from Auckland. I was 61 years in Wellington, only 4 years in Auckland. But I'm an outsider. But I've come down several times, and it's what's intrigued me about the process. I have had connections with Christchurch City Council in my role as 32 years at the Office of the Ombudsman, as an investigator, an assistant ombudsman, a deputy ombudsman, and then for 2 years the ombudsman of jurisdiction over local government. And the key part of decisions that are made is that I'm now referred to as a public law specialist. Public law is around what are the rules whereby the citizens can engage in discretionary decision making that impacts on them. And that's what governments and councils do. They make discretionary decisions. They don't make decisions because they have to. It's because they choose to, based on evidence, based on debate. But ultimately, if it's going to impact on you, the argument is in the community is, well, where's your voice in this? And two perspectives for me, consultation and grievance around this whole process. The grievance part is, again, as an outsider, is that as a result of the earthquakes, there was supposed to be remediation. From my perspective anyway, it hasn't happened. And that raised a whole bunch of questions. It's happened in some parts, but not in this area, even though it was indicated right from the outset that it was a priority. Consultation, you're going through a consultation process, which continues. Consultation, there's three elements from a public law perspective in consultation. Adequate information, adequate time to consider that information, debate it, but also a decision to be made with an open mind. There's no predetermination. So the information presented tonight, if we say, Lord Stein, the English jurist, said context is everything. But actually, from my 32 years in the Ombudsman's perspective, it's not so much context is everything as perception is everything. Because context is how you perceive the truth of a matter. Truth's never found in individual reports, because reports are the truth according to the author. The truth is when you actually take different reports and you distill that from reading it, asking questions and challenging it. And the thing about perception is that perception is dependent on the information you have in front of you. And as goes through the Western world has shown, if you control information, you control perception. And that's the heart of any question where you're being presented with an outcome which you're told is inevitable. You should always be asking, well, what's the evidence for that? If it's evidence-based opinion, it is at the end of the day an opinion, and you ask for that evidence. So information is really what I'm talking about, is that if you're going through a consultation process or you're trying to make a decision, it's very important that you get all the information, not selective bits or bits which are presented to you which are basically self-fulfilling prophecies. They're information designed to support a predetermined conclusion. In business, information is gold. In politics, information is power. For bureaucrats, information is about control. Because again, if you control information, you control perception. I'm not suggesting that all bureaucrats are bad. They're not. What I'm suggesting though is that you should always be challenging the information that's presented and asking questions. My mother once said that about information, the devil's in the detail, but so are the guardian angels. You need to actually look and interrogate. And again, the two challenging things in a consultation process and information, when you've got it, the two icebergs, predetermination, lack of transparency. So the predetermination aspect is that where people genuinely believe that a particular outcome is the way we should go, people tend to then line up the information to support their view. There's nothing wrong with people having a predisposition. We all have predispositions. We all have particular views. The danger is when that predisposition becomes predetermination, so that we actually close our mind to any other way of looking at things. So I was sitting there and looking at the presentation and thinking, actually, I hadn't, and all the stuff I'd sort of read about this, that's information which would be useful to, not just useful to have, very important to have. And as the description slide that Eleanor showed, in terms of the GOIMA, the Local Government Official Information Act process, the report was commissioned. It wasn't released straight away. It was released eventually, but in many ways it was hidden in plain sight. It was almost accidentally found by people looking for backup information. Is that a good thing? Should it have come out in a different way? Yes, the person who made the request got it, but the whole point of official information and local government information is that if information is important to inform a debate, it shouldn't just be on the basis that someone will find it and only that person gets it. If it's important, it should be presented in a way that everyone has access to it. You don't have to believe it, but it helps you have you're better informed in your decision. And again, consultation. Remember about consultation, the public law principle is that consultation is not negotiation. The fact that I believe a particular outcome is what should happen, I'm not entitled for that outcome to happen. But what I'm entitled to in a free participatory democracy is that I get to say my view, and I get the feeling that people will actually listen to my view, and if they disagree, that's fine. At least I've had the opportunity to say that. Because I think the fact that all you people have turned up is you do believe in a participatory democracy. You've got candidates for the election here, and the fundamental thing in any democratic situation is we're talking about government of the people, for the people, by the people. But to do that, you have to have information out there and available. And that's where we come to, all those aspects that information is at the end of a talk. So it informs your decision, but ultimately you've got to form your opinion. But that process of being able to form your opinion, the other public law tools, and I won't bore you too much more, we're talking about natural justice and procedural fairness. And there's been aspects of what's happened over the last couple of years where procedural fairness hasn't happened. And natural justice is that right to be heard, to express a view, and for not to be subjected to a predetermined outcome. So that I express my view and I've got the impression that the decision maker is not listening, they're not interested, they're already determined what happens. That's the breach of natural justice. And that's part of democracy. Democracy is messy. A former chief ombudsman, Sir John Robertson, defined it that yes, democracy is messy, but if we want efficiency, we should have a fascist state. Democracy is that ability for people to express a view, be heard. The other part of democracy is sometimes we're not on the winning side, but at least we've had the opportunity to state that. And what you're looking for your decision makers is that they are listening with open minds. So to wrap that all up, it's really saying that in this particular issue that as a community you're dealing with, you do want to make sure that you have all the information. It's very easy on this particular issue to get caught into a sloganised approach that it's either this or it's that. It's never this or that. There's a whole mixture of things that can actually happen. In terms of what is the right solution, it's not a question of starting with the solution you think you want. It's a matter of starting off with what is the problem, what are the options, and then trying to think what is the best solution. And my final point is when it does come to options, when the consultation comes back, I'm not here to lecture you, but the advice I'd suggest is be very careful to make sure that the options you're presented with are in fact all the options. There's always a danger in the consultation process if you're told there's either option A or option B. In a democracy, there's always an option C, which is any other option which emerges from the debate or which you want to propose. You should never accept a situation, and we should never accept a situation where we're told it has to be A or B. In any situation, in an open mind, you want to have the ability to say, well, what about C? What about D? And what about, have we actually defined the problem correctly in the first place? So science is based on lots of assumptions, and the presentation tonight showed that there's lots of different assumptions that can be made. Some can be in greater detail, some take, a down the middle route, but when you actually look at the different points that you can end up, there was quite a huge degree of difference between what the NIWA report was suggesting was a likely outcome and the other reports, which, is a question of one right or wrong, or is it a question of, well, what were those underlying assumptions? If you're going to actually form an opinion based on an outcome of a report, you do need an exercise like tonight where someone actually explained what that report meant. If you were to read the NIWA report, would you have understood it as well as having had the benefit of the author explain what went into it? And if you're going to rely on making a decision or expressing an opinion, this is the opportunity. So, public law information, a key part of your thought of the community is access to information, is transparency. What do we expect as citizens? A fair process, just outcomes, and transparency. Fair processes don't guarantee just outcomes. And a just outcome, just because something is legal, doesn't mean to say it's the right thing to do. And transparency actually underpins everything. If you don't have adequate information so that you can ask what, who, why, okay, it's very hard then to make a decision where you feel that, all right, I've got a pretty good understanding of the whole context, that my perception of the problem is as good as it could be. And you've always got to ask yourself in terms of perception, is this my perception or is this someone else's perception that's been, if you like, influenced on me because I've been given options which stop me asking questions that I might otherwise ask. So.
What I notice is a tone of indifference that you're dealing with. And also what I noticed too, there was no timelines. If they say that you're going to do a thing, there should be a timeline. And so there's no accountability there. So it's actually the process, but it's the indifference that I find is really, really annoying. And just a classic example, I've just been working a year and a half on the free waters, and then we were told they come to Christchurch, and then I get an email after me ringing them for a whole year, every second week. I get an email, oh no, you're not allowed to speak.
It seems that our community board, as representatives of the community, they're very rooted in the community, so their responsibility is to the community. But they find it difficult to get information from the councils, and in fact they have to get the information the same way as the members of the public. And so they're quite hamstrung, and I'm wondering, it didn't seem to always be that way, and I'm wondering how we can better support or advocate for our community boards to be able to be that information gatherer. I think that many times they'd like to give us more information, but they're unable to and they're hamstrung. Is that a product of the structure of the law around community boards?
It shouldn't be. The community boards are set up in the framework and the local government act because the community boards are there to be the voice of the community. Yes, they're part of it, but then again, so is the council. It is government of the people, by the people. The council is trying to make, is supposed to be making the best decisions. To make the best decisions, you've got to actually hear what your community says. Getting access to information, it's always, in the whole of my 32 years at the Office of the Ombudsman, dealing with concerns by elected members that they weren't getting all the information was always a difficulty. The balance, though, is that sometimes as an elected member, you get access to information where there is an element of confidence or privacy, and there's an obligation to use that information appropriately. That not everything can be released. You know, it's not a situation where all information can be released without an impact. You do have to take into account privacy and confidentiality. But for the most part, most information can be released in some form. If it's commercially sensitive, it can be aggregated. The thrust can come through. And I was intrigued, at times when we're told that actually everything is so sensitive that we can't release anything, which isn't true. Sensitive information can be withheld, can be protected, but other information can be provided. And that's it. The key part of consultation is adequate information. Even if I can't get everything, even if some details have to be withheld, do I get sufficient information so that I can understand what's going on, who was involved, why we're doing this, so that I can express my view as to whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Good jobs here. My experience in this is that it's been very, very difficult to question technical analysis done by the council. They're not really interested in answering questions about that. So as a community, how can you use public law resources to get to that information? Like, who do we go to if we're hitting a stone wall?
I mean, the first thing is your first tool in the public law toolbox is to actually request the information. In a local government environment, the government gives you the right to request access. What's happened over a period of time, though, is that the perception has been given that if you make a request for information, it's going to take 20 days. The law has never said 20 days. The law has always been as soon as reasonably practical. If the information should be made available, it can be. If in fact, for example, it's something which there's a report prepared, it needs to be peer reviewed, information can be released with those caveats. So the NIWA report was produced, as I understand it, with an idea that this was going to be released at the end of the year, 2018, and a year later it came through. By any stretch of the imagination, that's way too slow and way too long. If you get the information enables you to ask more questions and to test it. So your first public law point is to request the information, but your overall public law principle that you're trying to establish in any situation where there's going to be a decision made by decision makers which impacts on you is to actually be able to have input into that. So, it's taking those wider questions, and if something is going to be done which impacts on me, I should have an ability to at least know, what is being taken into account, and I should have a chance to actually have that opinion. So, ultimately, you make the requests for information. If you can't get it, you go to an ombudsman. If you can't get it from an ombudsman, you might go down other avenues, but, going into the legal process, going to court, if you have to go to court to get information, you've almost lost already. I mean, it seems to be, it's your right in terms of information in New Zealand. The intent, the intent of Parliament, the whole intent of the exercise was that as citizens we should have access to sufficient information to be able to express an opinion. And I think over time people have tended to actually back off pursuing their right to information and accepting reasons why they can't have it far too easily, or accepting a time frame which actually impacts on that. So it's a long-winded way of saying if you're dissatisfied, in a situation, you need to actually voice your dissatisfaction. Then, if you've had a chance to express your opinion, if in fact everyone else in the room disagrees with you, sometimes we have to accept that our perception is not shared. It's the situation where you never get the chance to express your opinion, or you feel that I can't actually make a really good opinion because I don't know enough about the situation. I can't get the information. I can't get to access to someone who's going to explain the information for me.
Leo, thank you.